The strange but true story featured on this podcast contains details some people may find distressing. Listener discretion is advised. I'm Chaya Samuel, and things are about to get weird. Hello, you lovely lot. Welcome back to Things Are About to Get Weird. I'm so excited to be back with a full episode for you today. I really missed putting these together during my few weeks off. That said, the topic of today's story is far less jolly than this intro would suggest, I'm afraid. Not only is it a true crime case involving a tragic murder, but there's a bizarre paranormal aspect to it as well. A warning before we start that along with the murder aspect, there will also be mentions of violence and also pregnancy loss in this episode, so please do be aware of that. But as you know, I always try not to dwell on the difficult details any longer than necessary. So if you're ready, allow me to tell you the story of the life, death, and afterlife of Zona Heaster Shue. In October of 1896, a young woman from Greenbrier County, located in the US state of West Virginia, was out running a few mundane errands when a chance meeting would change the course of her life in the most terrible way imaginable. Zona Heaster, whose surname is sometimes pronounced Heaster. I hear it both ways, it's a 50-50 split, so I'm going to go with Heaster as it feels more natural, but whose first name was actually Elva, although she chose to go by her middle name Zona instead, was just 23 years old when she became acquainted with a local blacksmith, who seemed to take an immediate shine to her. Erasmus Stribling Trout Shue, yes, that really was his name, there are some unique monikers in this story for sure, was significantly older than her at 37, and like her, he preferred to go by a different name than the one he was given at birth. When he met Zona, he introduced himself as Edward, but for the purposes of this story, I'm going to stick with Erasmus, as it seems that he would flip and change his name depending on who he was dealing with. So let's keep it simple. Many sources note that Erasmus was quite handsome. From the photo of him I've seen, he definitely looked very smart and well groomed, and he must have had some degree of charm to him as Zona quickly fell in love with the blacksmith. From the outside, it looked like a whirlwind romance, and within a matter of weeks the pair had married. They opted to elope, and Zona wore a burgundy dress with a high-necked collar in line with the fashion at the time, and appeared to be completely smitten with the man she had chosen as her husband. But not everyone in Zona's life was as thrilled with this rapid turn of events as she was. And here we meet the third key figure in this story, Zona's mother, Mary Jane Heaster. Like many parents, she looked at Erasmus with a more critical eye than her only daughter had. Without the rose-tinted glasses of young love, Mary Jane saw something deeper in her new son-in-law, and she did not like it. Whether it was mother's intuition or stemmed from the fact he tied the much younger Zona into a marriage without pausing to really think it through, Mary Jane had a bad feeling about the union, and that's likely before she even knew the half of it when it came to Erasmus's past. Although it's unlikely that he divulged this information to his new wife and mother-in-law. Not only had he spent 2 years locked up in the state penitentiary after being found guilty of stealing a horse, this was actually Erasmus's third marriage. The first time he had tied the knot, he ended up abandoning his wife and their young child, which led to her filing for divorce. In those days, that was no easy task and must have been incredibly difficult for her. His second marriage, however, ended under even more sinister circumstances. At the time he married his next wife, Erasmus was living in Pocahontas County, which is also in West Virginia, and one day he said he had been carrying out some repairs on the roof of their home. Part of this process involved moving bricks around, and at some stage during his work, a truly tragic incident occurred. Erasmus claimed that whilst carrying a brick, it accidentally slipped from his fingers and went crashing towards the ground below. His wife happened to be standing in the pathway of the falling brick, and it struck her on the head, killing her instantly. Now, of course, terrible accidents like this do happen from time to time. They're very rare, but not unheard of. And perhaps no one would have looked at Erasmus with so much suspicion had he properly grieved his loss before perhaps settling into a new relationship and living a quiet life. But none of those things happened. Instead, he started to look for wife number 3, and when he found her in the shape of Zona Heaster, he locked her in with marriage as soon as possible. But only 3 months after they said "I do" and should have still been firmly in the honeymoon stage, something unthinkable happened. On the 23rd of January, 1897, an errand boy discovered Zona's lifeless body lying at the foot of the staircase in her home, face down. She was stretched outwards, with one arm fully extended and the other tucked under her torso, with her head turned off to one side. The boy who found her had been sent into their house by Erasmus, who was busy at his blacksmith's workshop, and instructed him to ask Zona whether she needed anything in the way of shopping. The young man immediately raised the alarm, and Erasmus, followed by a physician named Dr. Knapp, rushed to the scene. Although the doctor tried to resuscitate Zona, it was clear that he was too late. She was gone, and no one could understand what had happened. From the start, though, odd details started to emerge. To begin with, there are 2 different versions of events reported when it comes to what happened after Zona's body was found, but they both end up intertwining. Some sources say that when Dr. Knapp arrived at the house, Erasmus had already moved Zona's body to their bed and dressed her in a gown which many believe was that same burgundy one she wore the day they got married. The second, and perhaps the more reliable version of the tale, is that Dr. Knapp arrived when Zona was in the original position the young boy had found her in, with her widower weeping over her body. Both versions then merge and have the same outcome, and that is that Dr. Knapp did not carry out a proper inspection of Zona's body. By all accounts, Erasmus seemed distraught at the news of his new wife's death, with Dr. Knapp remarking that the widower sobbed and wept as he knelt over Zona's body, holding her neck and shoulders in his arms. Of course, these emotions would seem very natural given the tragic and unexpected circumstances of Zona's passing, but some began to look at Erasmus's reaction with a more skeptical eye when they learned that he had actually impeded the investigation into what happened that day. According to a newspaper report from the Greenbrier Independent published shortly after the incident, Erasmus instructed the doctor to, quote, make no further examination of the body. It continued, saying that he assisted in dressing the body and in doing so put around the neck a high collar and a large veil several times folded and tied in a large bow under the chin, and that the head was observed by a number of the witnesses to be very loose upon the neck and would drop from side to side when not supported. The details in this quote are very important, so be sure to bear them in mind for later. The result of all of this is that Dr. Knapp's officially recorded cause of death for Zona was everlasting faint. In other words, he decided that she had fallen down as though she had passed out, but had instead simply died. Now, Zona had no known serious medical conditions and was a bright, healthy young woman. None of this made any sense to her loved ones. And what was even more strange is that some reports at the time actually cited her cause of death as childbirth. I know, I was confused when I read that too, as there's absolutely no evidence that Zona had been pregnant, and no mention of a pregnancy loss was recorded when her body was discovered, so it's a bit of a mystery as to where this came from. My suspicion is that because the official cause of death was so vague, and because childbirth did involve more risk to the mother back in the 1800s, it might be that it was a conclusion that one publication jumped to, and then others followed suit. Now, you'd think that if someone died under such unexplained circumstances even back then, that a more thorough look into what had transpired would take place. But in this case, you'd be wrong. Zona was actually buried the very next day, on the 24th of January, in what's known today as the Soul Chapel Methodist Cemetery in Greenbrier County. Before her burial, there was a gathering and a viewing of her casket, and whilst almost everyone in attendance looked at Erasmus with sincere pity, as the grieving widower of this well-liked young woman, they also couldn't help but notice that his behaviour seemed a little odd. Once again, he was very openly emotional, which is completely normal, of course, but like he had done on the previous day, he used this outpouring of grief to make sure that he was closer to Zona's body in her coffin than anyone else, blocking people from getting near enough to really get a close look at her. He also made a point of placing a scarf over Zona's neck and propping her head up with a pillow, as though he was trying to disguise something about the appearance or angle of her neck. After the viewing was complete and Zona was buried, those who had gathered to pay their respects to her dispersed and continued to grieve in their own ways privately, and amongst them, of course, was her mother, Mary Jane. Now, unlike the majority of the mourners present at her daughter's funeral, Mary did not look at Erasmus as simply a man dealing with the untimely passing of his one true love. Her negative feelings towards him had not subsided after the pair married, and she was sure that there was more to Zona's death than met the eye. So she did the only thing that came naturally to her as a devout Christian. She prayed each and every night that the truth would somehow be revealed to her, and soon enough, her prayers appeared to be answered in the most chilling manner possible. This is where our story takes a turn for the paranormal, depending on what you believe, of course. As many of you know, I am a believer in ghosts and spirits, but I'm going to save my thoughts on this specific tale until the end. One night, when Mary had woken up amid a broken and restless sleep, she saw a bright light by the side of her bed, which transformed into the figure of her only daughter. Mary said that Zona's spirit caused the room to turn cold, and she began to reveal details of what really happened to her. The grieving mother reported that Zona visited her on 4 consecutive nights, adding further details to the story each time, until Mary had a full picture of the fate that had befallen her child. Zona had not died from natural causes at all, but had been murdered in cold blood by her husband Erasmus. Zona told her mother that he had been incredibly violent towards her, and that after an argument over dinner the night before her body was found, the blacksmith strangled her to death, breaking her neck at the first joint in the process. This next detail is really horrible, it chilled me to the bone, but Mary said that Zona's ghost turned its head 180 degrees, so that it was facing entirely the wrong way, to show that her neck had indeed been broken. Oof. Mary was entirely convinced that these encounters were completely real, and that it truly was her daughter visiting her from beyond the grave, giving her the information she needed to get some real justice in the case. And that's exactly what she intended to do. At this point, you might be thinking that this story sounds familiar, and that could be for a couple of reasons. Firstly, it definitely has some parallels with other cases I've covered here on the podcast, like the Red Barn murder in episode 31, and even the story of Teresita Bassa in episode 42. But you may be thinking that it sounds exactly like the tale of the Greenbrier Ghost, and you would be correct. The Greenbrier Ghost is the name this story is more commonly told under. That was the nickname that Zona's spirit was given after these events, as we often see happen in cases like this. And there's a very good reason why this tale in particular has gone down in history. So let me explain what happened next. Mary was utterly determined to make the knowledge of what she had experienced with these visitations from Zona's ghost public. But further than that, she wanted the entire investigation into her death to be reopened. She contacted the local prosecuting attorney, a man named John A. Preston, and she decided to just lay it all out there. She told John Preston everything, going into detail about every word Zona's spirit had said to her, and made it clear that she believed Erasmus was behind it all, and John Preston believed her, or at least he believed that the case was worth revisiting. Her conviction about the events was so strong and so compelling that Preston agreed at the end of their meeting that he would formally reopen the investigation, and in his mind, Erasmus Shue was definitely a key suspect. The attorney's initial inquiries turned out to be interesting in themselves, as it took him no time at all to uncover the details of Erasmus's shady past, that at that time had still been unknown to many. This included his 2 previous marriages, his time in prison, and further details about acts of violence he'd committed in the past. The attorney's next step was to sit down with Dr. Knapp and gain a deeper insight into how he had concluded that Zona died of natural causes. And this was a real turning point in the case. As they spoke, Dr. Knapp admitted that not only had a proper examination of Zona's body not been performed at the request of Erasmus, but that during the brief moments he did get to observe her, he had indeed noticed some bruising on her neck. There were just too many red flags to ignore, and in the February of 1897, Zona's remains were exhumed, which meant a full autopsy could finally be performed. Whilst all of this was going on, people around Greenbrier County started noticing more odd behaviour from Erasmus. He would say things which raised eyebrows, boasting that no one would ever be able to prove he killed Zona, and seemed very different to the distraught widower they had all witnessed just a few weeks earlier. Then the results of the autopsy were returned. Those who examined her body found evidence of strangulation around her neck, including bruises which were consistent with those made by a person's hands and fingers. But that wasn't all. It was found that Zona's neck was indeed broken, with fractures at not only the first but the second cervical vertebrae too. Therefore, a brand new cause of death was recorded for Zona Heaster Shue. She had indeed been strangled to death, with her windpipe being crushed and her neck broken. It was now clear to everyone involved that there had been a dreadful miscarriage of justice when she was buried the first time, in that there had been no justice for her killing whatsoever, and the authorities were adamant that this would not be the case after she was buried for the second time. A new inquest was ordered, and Erasmus Shue was arrested on suspicion of murder. By this time, locals were absolutely captivated by the case. Reports noted that more men than were really needed arrived to help dig up Zona's coffin during her exhumation, and that all eyes were now firmly on the legal proceedings that had started against Erasmus, with questions being asked about why he had suddenly become a suspect after his wife had first been buried, and so the authorities were forced to make an admission which left locals completely stunned, that the evidence which had prompted them to restart the investigation was of a supernatural or paranormal nature. This was obviously highly unusual. There was no precedent for this mentioned in any of the law books at the time, and although this was a completely unorthodox practice, it was hard to deny that Mary's account about her experience had been confirmed by the autopsy. Erasmus's trial date was set, and the attorneys on both sides began to formulate their plans of action. Soon, the prosecution realised that it was really unavoidable that they would have to put Mary Jane on the stand to testify and be cross-examined, even though John Preston was incredibly reluctant and concerned about it. And after the trial began on the 22nd of June 1897, that's exactly what happened. The actual transcript of Mary's cross-examination by the defence is still available today. It was properly archived, so we know exactly how this all went down. Of course, the defence's main tactic was to try and convince the 12 jurors that Mary had simply had a dream or a more abstract vision, rather than a genuine spirit encounter. And here's what she said in response to that accusation. Quote, "It was no dream. She came back and told me that he was mad that she didn't have no meat cooked for supper, but she said she had plenty, and said that she had butter and apple butter, apples, and named over 2 or 3 kinds of jellies, pears and cherries and raspberry jelly, and she says I had plenty. And she says, don't you think that he was mad and just took down all my nice things and packed them away and just ruined them? And she told me where I could look down at the back of Aunt Martha Jones's, in the meadow in a rocky place, that I could look in a cellar behind some loose plank and see. It was a square log house, and it was hewed up to the square, and she said for me to look right at the right-hand side of the door as you go in, and at the right-hand corner as you go in. Well, I saw the place just exactly as she told me, and I saw blood right there where she told me, and she told me something about that meat every night she came, just as she did the first night. She came 4 times and 4 nights, but the second night she told me that her neck was squeezed off at the first joint, and it was just as she told me. After this, the defense continued to try and make Mary admit that she had likely been dreaming, as she was so preoccupied with wanting to know the truth about her daughter's death, thinking about it every waking moment, and implied that this had probably just spilled over into her dreams. She was asked again whether she was sure it was not a dream, and replied, "Yes, sir, it was not a dream. I don't dream when I am wide awake, to be sure, and I know I saw her right there with me." She was asked if she was generally superstitious, and she said she was not. And then, fascinatingly, the defense asked whether she had touched Zona's ghost when it appeared, and her answer was heartbreaking. She said, "Yes, sir. I got up on my elbows and reached out a little further, as I wanted to see if people came in their coffins. And I sat up and leaned on my elbow, and there was a light in the house. It was not a lamplight. I wanted to see if there was a coffin, but there was not. She was just like she was when she left this world. It was just after I went to bed, and I wanted her to come and talk to me, and she did. This was before the inquest, and I told my neighbours. They said she was exactly as I told them she was." Now, as for the rest of the trial, Erasmus did take the stand in his own defence, but it's said that that was a bit of a disaster. He rambled a lot and did a poor job of convincing the jury of his innocence, despite his plea of not guilty. This was in stark contrast to Mary Jane's time on the stand, where she was strong and unwavering whilst delivering her evidence, never backing down for a moment. All of this put the judge in a difficult position, because Zona's injuries aside, the prosecution's case largely rested on the story that her ghost had pointed the finger at Erasmus from the spirit realm. This is what the judge said to the jury ahead of their deliberations. Quote, "There was no witness to the crime charged against defendant Shue, and the state rests its case for conviction wholly upon circumstances connecting the accused with the murder charged. So the connection of the accused with the crime depends entirely upon the strength of the circumstantial evidence introduced by the state. There is no middle ground for you, the jury, to take. The verdict inevitably and logically must be for murder in the first degree or for an acquittal." And it took the jury no time at all to decide which of these options it would be. After deliberating for just an hour and 10 minutes, they returned their verdict: guilty. They did, however, ask for the judge to show him some mercy, and opt for a sentence of life in prison rather than the death penalty, and this was granted. Erasmus Shue was ordered to spend the remainder of his life locked up in the West Virginia State Penitentiary, though many locals were not content with this sentence. A mob began to form, and planned to remove Erasmus from his cell at the county jail before subjecting him to the same fate he had given Zona: death caused by a broken neck. They had planned to hang him, but at the last moment, thanks to a tip-off from a neighbour of one of the mob's leaders, the sheriff was able to stop the vigilantes in their tracks and confiscate the rope they had intended to use in their plan. As it turns out, though, those unhappy with Erasmus's sentence would not have to wait long before they got their preferred outcome, as just a few years after he was jailed, some say 3, some say 8, he actually died of an unnamed epidemic disease, most likely the flu, in prison. No family member came to claim his body. When reading about this case, it's common to see it referred to as the only known case in which testimony from a ghost helped convict a murderer. In fact, there's even a sign on Interstate 64 in West Virginia, near to where Zona is buried, which says exactly this. I'm not 100% sure that this is true. Perhaps if it's referring to a ghost alone and not a vision or a premonition or a dream like we saw in the Red Barn murder case, which took place decades before this story in the English county of Suffolk. Regardless, it's still absolutely bizarre and incredibly fascinating. But what do I make of the Greenbrier Ghost story? It's a weird one for me because, as I say, I do believe in ghosts. But the skeptical part of my brain does keep pointing out that there is a chance that Mary Jane was dreaming, as it's not at all unusual for our dreams to reflect things that are on our minds throughout the day. And Mary admitted herself that she thought about her daughter's death constantly, which is understandable as she was a grieving mother with no answers, and would have been desperate to find them. But then I think, well, how on earth could she have known that Zona's neck was indeed broken in the exact place she says the ghost told her about? Could this have been subconscious, that she thought it was weird that Erasmus had covered Zona's neck with that high-necked dress? And then again with the scarf in her casket? It's quite unusual to hear about a ghostly encounter where there have been full conversations involved, or very clear speech coming through. And when Mary said that she had touched the ghost and that Zona was just like she was when she left this world, it makes me feel very unsure. I absolutely want to believe Mary. I feel like I'm more so in the believer camp than the skeptic camp, but I can't say that I'm 100% convinced. One nice detail in this story is that Zona's grave is still maintained to this day. There are often fresh flowers placed there, which I think is lovely. The only thing is, I just wish that her headstone read Zona Heaster instead of Zona Heaster Shue. I hate that his name is on the gravestone. But interestingly, just below her name, it also refers to her as the Greenbrier Ghost, which firmly places the tale of her death in the West Virginia history books. She will be forever remembered that way. There's no doubt in my mind that Erasmus did murder her. Everything about him was incredibly suspicious, and although the truth came out in the strangest of ways, I'm glad that it did. I believe it's important to dig deeper into the stories behind these folk tale style names that people are often linked with, like the Greenbrier Ghost. And remember that before she was immortalized with this label, she was Elva Zona Heaster, a young woman with the dream of a happy life. Well, I don't know about you, but I found that one really quite emotional. I just feel so terrible for Zona and, of course, her poor mother. They both went through so much, but at least there was some justice in the end. I'd be beyond intrigued to hear what you think about this case, where you land on the believer/skeptic debate, and whether you've heard of any other cases which might dispute that claim that this is the only one where the testimony of a ghost helped to convict a murderer. I'll be getting on to all of my usual outro bits and bobs in a moment, but not before I round things off with weird media. I think this has to be the definition of weird media with the film I have to recommend to you today. It's definitely not a hidden gem, as it's just done very well at the Oscars, but nonetheless, I can't help but give a shout out to the movie Poor Things. To say that this piece of cinema is bizarre is quite an extreme understatement, but if you're here listening today, I'm guessing you're quite partial to that anyway. Poor Things is one of the weirdest films I've ever seen, but it also might be one of the best, and for me, most of that is to do with the performances. Emma Stone plays the lead character named Bella Baxter, and the whole plot explores her evolution. I don't want to spoil the story, but let's just say that as the result of a traumatic event followed by a bizarre medical experiment, The life of Bella Baxter begins again from scratch, and we see all of the twists and turns of how this happens as the film goes on. Willem Dafoe plays the doctor who performs this experiment, and he is just fantastic too, as is Mark Ruffalo, who we're introduced to partway through. To be honest, every single cast member does an incredible job. I could just sit here and list them all, and some of the more minor characters end up stealing many of the scenes that they're in. But Emma Stone completely and utterly deserved the Best Actress award for her performance, in my opinion. If you're a David Lynch fan like myself, I think you'll enjoy Poor Things. It gave me those vibes pretty much all the way along, and you definitely have to go into it with an open mind because it's just plain surreal at times. What I will say though, and this is a pretty big caveat, is that there are some very challenging and often quite messed up themes running through it. It really is a difficult watch at times. I would kind of proactively apply all of the trigger warnings to it. I think it's the kind of film that's just not for everyone, and there were bits in the story that I actually really disliked, and they were the bad kind of weird in my opinion. But what got me through the moments and themes where I was like, oh god, what the hell is this? This is horrible, were the characters and how they were brought to life. Genuinely some of the best acting I've ever seen in my life, and the visuals and set design elements were pure perfection. If you've watched Poor Things, I would be very intrigued to know whether it was anything like what you imagined it would be. It definitely wasn't what I was picturing, but overall it was definitely fascinating. Okay, some very speedy shout-outs to my sources for today. There was a brilliant Huffington Post article from February 2016 by Gary Rogers. We had an All That's Interesting piece by Eric Hawkins, edited by John Kurowski. That was from September 2022. An article on the Greenbrier Valley website that was written and researched by Belinda Anderson. A very in-depth piece with lots of information from the time on the West Virginia Explorer website. That was by David Sibrey from January of this year. And finally, a newspaper clipping from the Beckley Post-Herald. That was from all the way back in October of 1964. If you've enjoyed today's episode, please do consider giving us a quick star rating if you're listening on Spotify, and feel free to use that Q&A function to let me know what you make of the story. It's a really fun way to have your take on the case displayed on the episode page. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts, I would hugely appreciate a review if you have a spare moment. A big thank you to everyone who takes the time to rate or review. It really does help out the show. Social media wise, you can find us on Instagram and Threads at Things Get Weird Podcast, and on Facebook by searching for Things Are About to Get Weird. And our email address is thingsgetweirdpodcast@gmail.com. A massive thank you for joining me today, and I'll chat to you again next week in a new edition of Weird Fix. So, until next time, take care of yourself and others and keep it weird, but the good kind of weird.